Welcome to the July meeting, the Essex County Field Naturalists Club, still on Zoom. Corey normally hosts, but he's unavailable tonight, so I volunteered to host for this evening's presentation. Our guest speaker this month is Lauren Weller, who's going to talk about a very challenging subject, the idea of restoration in agricultural landscapes, which is 90% of the landscape in Essex County. So there are many, many challenges towards restoration in this type of situation that we have here. So it's a very important subject to talk about here. So I can turn it over to Lauren and she can get going. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. Now you should be able to see it.
Yes.
Can you? Okay. Yeah. Just trying to pull up my view and move all the faces out of my way. Okay, so good evening and thank you for having me here tonight. My name is Lauren Weller and I'm excited to speak to you this evening about conservation agriculture. But before we start, I wanted to take a moment to position myself in respect to where we sit today. I'm an immigrant settler, a scholar and an educator, a mother of South African heritage. And before my people were South African, they were European, of British, French, and Dutch origin. In 2017, my husband and I moved to Canada, where I'm now a master's student at the Great Lakes Institute at the University of Windsor and the Farming and Freshwater Ecology Research Network Program Coordinator. I know it's a mouthful, it's the phone coordinator in the Healthy Headwaters Lab. Although I'm coming to you virtually, I'd like to acknowledge that where I sit in Windsor, and likely where many of us are joining from in Essex County, is the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi. I also just wanted to share a couple of my qualifications. I have a BSc Honours in Ecology and Environmental Management from the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa, Johannesburg, South Africa. I also have postgraduate certificates in Environmental Law and Sustainable Development Law, as well as Land and Water Law. And I've just completed my university teaching certificate from the University of Windsor. Also have 10 years experience working in mining environmental management. I've worked in 12 countries across Africa and have come back to academia mainly because I wanted to stop digging holes and start fixing the problem. So I'm researching soil health and land-based solutions to eutrophication. And I'll get into a little bit later what eutrophication is and how soil links to it. So now that we know who's talking, let's get orientated into tonight's talk. First up, I'm going to indulge in a bit of storytelling regarding the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Then we're going to dive into some soil degradation and its impacts today before looking at some of the ways we can tackle the problem, including maybe some of the modern approaches to regenerating soils. I'll also share a little bit about my own research and what we're finding with regards to restoration and conservation of agricultural lands right here in Essex County. And then finally, I was hoping to open up the floor and hear your thoughts on how we can improve conservation in the agricultural landscape such as Essex County. So if Franklin D. Roosevelt once said that a nation that destroys its soil destroys itself. And I wanted you to sit with that for a moment and consider the role of soil in your life. So for many of us, this might have been hard to do. In fact, I'd wager for those of us who live in cities, we primarily think of soil as dirt or mud, possibly something to shake off our boots when we come indoors. But soil is literally the basis of human civilization and our natural world. And all conservation, ultimately, both on land and in water, starts with soils. And so let us begin with a story. It's the late 19th century in the United States, and early pioneers are heading west. Driven by the prospects of free farmland, many cannot resist the lure of the tall, semi-arid grassland in the Midwest and the Southern Plains. And so they settle there to farm and make a new life. And the decades that follow are prosperous, and life is good in the new lands. But when the 1930s roll in, so do the strong winds, drought, and clouds of dust that plague nearly 75% of the United States. The era between 1931 and 1939 becomes known as the Dust Bowl, and with it comes untold ecological and economic suffering, during a time when America is already suffering greatly under the Great Depression. So while the economic depression coupled with extended drought contribute to making the Dust Bowl, the true seeds of the Dust Bowl are in fact sowed during the 1920s, when a post-World War I recession leads farmers to try these new mechanized farming techniques, such as a way to increase profits. Many buy plows and other farming equipment to work the land, such that between 1925 and 1930, more than 5 million acres of natural lands are plowed. Lands that previously had been covered with tall grass prairie species. These were dominated by drought-tolerant, deep-rooted grasses, which held the soils in place even during times of low rainfall, and they are now replaced with commercial crops. This leads to an overproduction of wheat, which when coupled with the Great Depression, led to severely reduced market prices. With the wheat market flooded and people too poor to buy, farmers are unable to earn back their production costs and thus move to further expand their fields in an effort to turn a profit. They cover the prairie with wheat and leave any unused fields bare. In the years that follow, topsoil literally blows away in the winds, leaving the land less fertile, vulnerable to drought, and inhospitable for growing crops. Finally, in 1930, in a brutal twist of fate, the rain stopped coming and drought sets in. Roughly 1/3 of the farmers leave their homes and head to the mild climate of California in search of migrant work, leaving millions of acres bare and at the mercy of the wind. By 1932, 14 dust storms known as black blizzards are reported within a year, and within a year this would jump to 40. Millions of people flee the region. The government enacts aid programs to help, but by the end of 1934, roughly 35 million acres of farmland are ruined, and the topsoil covering 100 million acres has blown away. On the 14th of April, 1935, a day which comes to be known as Black Sunday, millions of tons of dirt and debris make their way from the plains all the way to Washington, D.C., pushing the U.S. Congress to pass the Soil Conservation Act of the U.S., which promotes healthy soil management and farming practices and pays farmers to put such practices to work on their farms. Despite this, it wasn't until 1939 when the rain returned that relief truly came. So you would think that that's the end of the story, and that following the lessons learned of the Dust Bowl, we're far more conscientious about our soil. But unfortunately, we are not. Despite the lessons learned, today 90% of the 450 million hectares of semi-arid land in North America still suffers from moderate to severe desertification. And in fact, by some estimates, overall in the world, we have less than 60 harvests left at current rates of soil loss. Although that in itself is a bit of a controversial statistic, there's no doubt that our soils are in trouble. And furthermore, looking beyond the loss of productivity, we are facing a multitude of challenges associated with both soil degradation and erosion, including increased nutrient runoff, erosion of topsoils, desertification, all of which seriously impact not only food security, but also water security and biodiversity. A classic example close to home is the eutrophication of the Great Lakes. Eutrophication is a buildup of nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, in our waters, leading to events such as the harmful algal blooms that are seen in Lake Erie and Lake Sinclair most summers. This eutrophication is primarily driven by the erosion of nutrient-rich agricultural soils and dissolved fertilizers, such as those that might stem from the greenhouse industry, running into and out of the drainage network. Ultimately, these nutrients make their way into the lake itself, where increased nutrient loading stimulates massive toxic algal blooms, threatening water supplies, fisheries, and recreation activities. Historically, we focused on point sources of pollution, such as wastewater treatment works or sewage outlets, which were responsible for much of the historical nutrient loading in the Great Lakes. These point sources, though, have largely been eliminated, along with the cleanup of other historical sources of pollution, such as factories. And so the water quality of these lakes, and particularly Lake Erie, has improved remarkably. But despite the improvements, eutrophication of our natural waters remains a challenge. However, in addressing these challenges, we may have an opportunity to revitalize freshwater ecosystems, preserve soils, sequester carbon, and increase biodiversity through the improved functioning of our agroecosystems. And one of the ways we can do this is through the implementation of agricultural conservation measures. These are actions that are taken at the farm scale, the aim of which is to maintain agricultural production while simultaneously reducing soil and nutrient runoff. Nutrient management, which refers to the optimization of fertilizer application, represents one of the most commonly adopted agricultural conservation measures. Here in Ontario, this takes the form of the 4R Nutrient Stewardship Program, which is run by Fertilizer Canada, but approximately 68% of farmers in Ontario follow some form of 4R nutrient stewardship. And while this has been really useful for reducing nutrient loading arising from agricultural fields, it neither protects soils nor prevents nutrient runoff completely. And so pictured here, what I've shown you, this is called the Toma Pyramid of Soil Health. And the premise here is that if we have healthy soils, we can improve the effectiveness of other measures, which we would put then below fields or under fields or in the riparian area in order to control nutrients leaving the field. And so how do we improve soil health? And because this is the base of our pyramid of soil health, we know that we have to improve soil health. Well, the key might be to be promoting practices that increase carbon in soils, because carbon plays a major role in binding and modulating nutrients within soils. So if you've got richer, more complex carbon soils, they're associated with richer, more resilient soil ecosystems. And when we have richer, more resilient soil ecosystems, they're associated with richer, more resilient above ground ecosystems. Healthy covered soils can also act as a carbon sink, whereas exposed bare soils release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. In short, if we regenerate our soils, it has the potential to increase food security, improve water quality, increase ecosystem services, promote biodiversity, and we can even draw down carbon, thus slowing or reversing some of the impacts of climate change. My own research, which I'll get to later, looks at the complexity of carbon in agricultural systems, and we use that as a potential restoration tool for these systems. So some of the common conservation measures that are used to improve soil health include reduced tillage in place of plowing. You can see that in the top right-hand corner. Another thing we do is intercropping of row crops such as beans and corn to avoid monocultures and improve system complexity. It's also good for pollinators to avoid these monocultures. Some farmers are also bringing animals back into the rotation, thus bringing natural fertilization and a kind of natural tillage when things like pigs dig up the fields. Finally, farmers are planting cover crops to improve soil coverage and increase carbon sequestration, especially in the winter months when soils are normally bare. And here in Windsor, Essex, it's a great place for it because our winters don't get as cold as they do further north. Cover crops such as drill radishes also draw in nutrients and minerals from deep in the soil up to the surface, where they can then be more easily accessed by crops, and then you don't have to put as much fertilizer on later. And while large operations with few employees may not be able to support the additional work required to sustain conservation measures, many farmers are finding that smaller, more diverse operations can be more resilient and profitable operations. I know here in Windsor-Essex County, many farmers have adopted the reduced tillage. However, adoption of cover cropping and livestock rotations specifically within row crop operations is far less common. Practices that trap and prevent soil from leaving the field, such as buffer strips, are commonly seen in Essex County. Personally, I'd love to see even more buffers, especially if we had buffers of native species, rather than you'll often see farmers will put a strip of grass along the edge of their field. And that's mainly for practical reasons in terms of like being able to easily replant it or to mow it and keep it looking neat. Another conservation measure that I would love to see taken up here in Essex is called agroforestry, and this practice incorporates tree and shrub planting or conservation alongside crops or livestock. So it's not only an efficient method of land utilization, but it also embraces the benefits provided by trees. So if you can picture the intentional combination of agriculture with forestry, it would increase biodiversity, it reduces erosion, and it also emphasizes the planting of indigenous species. And if you look underneath these trees, you'll notice that there's, some grasses and stuff underneath. And so agroforestry really kind of is the idea of just putting strips of native vegetation in between your crops. Beyond the conservation of agricultural landscapes, there's also a move to regenerate them. And that is not just keep them where they are, but actually improve them. So this photo was taken in my native South Africa in the semi-arid desert Karoo, Karoo. It's a semi-desert. So here farmers are working to replicate the natural systems. What they do is they mimic the way a large herd would move across the landscape. And they do this by instituting strict rotational grazing practices, and then also allowing the natural fire cycles to return. And by doing this, they've been able to restore these lands and even roll back the process of desertification caused by overgrazing. Here's another example of what until recently was only an innovative research area and is now becoming a reality. This is the first perennial wheat developed and marketed for sale. A perennial wheat, and it's the one on the left. A perennial wheat is one that does not die off at harvest time, and therefore it doesn't need to be replanted annually, but it comes back year after year after year. And so this is going to be game changing for soil health. especially, and it's also going to be quite disruptive in the farming economy, specifically sectors that rely on sales of seed, specifically trademark seeds. Because if you have to only buy your seed once and you don't have to replant it every year, they can't sell you a new seed every year. And so this is going to be quite interesting. They've started planting it in places in the US, and you can even buy certain products now that are made from this wheat. And so I'm just going to put something out to you quickly. If you think back to the lesson of the Dust Bowl, I want you now to have a look at the soil profile and tell me what you notice about the two wheat crops. The one on the left is perennial wheat, and the one on the right is conventional wheat. And you can either unmic yourself, or you can pop it into the chat, like whatever works easiest for you. I'm not actually sure I can see the chat in here, so somebody may have to read me an answer if there is one.
I don't see any chats, but I noticed that the root system on the perennial wheat is like much more complex and goes down right down to the bottom of the screen and
yeah,
the screen.
That's pretty much it. So a lot of our modern crops, including corn and wheat, they have these very small root systems because they're designed to grow tall and fast very quickly. But if we look at some of the original wheat species that we actually originally grew our modern conventional wheat species from, they had these really deep roots. And so A, they survive year on year. B, they need a lot less water because they can pull water from much further down in the soil column. They hold the soil in place. They need less nutrients because, again, they're pulling nutrients from further down in the soil column. And so you can see how crops like this are going to be like really game changing for how we grow food going forward. They're going to help with areas where we're seeing effects of climate change, where it's getting hotter and drier. And so like, I'm really excited about this kind of technology. This is one instance where you want them to be experimenting with wheat, as opposed to, maybe creating ever increasing intellectual property that, farmers have to pay every year for their seed. Okay, so now that we have a grounding in conservation of agricultural landscapes, I'm going to get a little bit more in depth into what's happening here in Essex County and how these concepts apply here and to my research. So I'm going to start by saying that Essex County is without a doubt an agricultural landscape. I'm sure you're field naturalists, so you're already aware of how few truly natural spaces we have left in Essex County. And since Essex also represents prime soil and climate for agriculture, it's important that we understand how to maximize ecosystem services and prevent the runoff of nutrients in these landscapes if we want to improve biodiversity and make sure that these landscapes remain as sustainable functioning spaces. And if we look at the most recent watershed report available from ERCA, you can see that the bulk of the county's water is rated as poor to very poor in terms of water quality. And so it's clear that there's a lot more work that needs to be done with regards to agricultural conservation in this region. One challenge we face in Essex is the idea that Brookston clay, which underlies much of the county, is different, and that many conservation measures used elsewhere may or may not be effective or practical here because of the heavy clay content. Another related challenge is the high proportion of tile drain fields. Tiles are essentially drains installed within the fields to lower the water table and quickly drain oversaturated soils. The problem is that tiles can exacerbate nutrient losses from the fields because water is very quickly shunted either from the field traveling through cracks or established flow paths in the clay, and it takes fertilizers and nutrients with it. So if you can picture, it's like a superhighway for nutrients from the field into our drain system and then into the lake. But they're essential for growing crops here in Windsor, Essex. It's really difficult on the clay, and so the tiles really aid our farmers. So it's just figuring out how to work with the tiles is where we're getting at. So my research, I'm currently looking at carbon in agricultural landscapes, and I'm looking both within soils and tile drains in an attempt to link the management actions taken in field to water quality that we can see coming out of the fields. And then the idea is I'm using carbon as a kind of tracer of soil health across the soil water interface. So we can see if soil health is impacting how much nutrients are leaching out of the field. But before I get into my research, I'm going to get a bit technical, and I'm going to talk to you about organic matter, specifically dissolved organic matter. And so organic matter acts as this bridge between land and water, and it's fundamental to nutrient cycling in both land and water environments. Organic matter generally refers to the large source of carbon-based compounds found on land and in water, and it's matter composed of organic compounds that have come from the remains of organisms such as plants and animals and their waste products in the environment. So dissolved organic matter is just that fraction of organic matter that is dissolved or is able to pass through a 0.2 micrometer filter. You may be more familiar with this dissolved organic matter in the context of humic substances, which are found in compost, or if you're a gardener who's made compost tea. Recently, we've come to understand that these humic substances that we couldn't really put a finger on what they were before, but they're actually recognizable compounds, but they're just being broken down. And so I want you to picture a pile of knitted items, each at different stages of being unraveled. Some may have originally been sweaters, but now only have the arms or maybe just the body section left. Some may only have the collar left. And if we do a chemical analysis of these, what will show up is the wool blend, or in this case, the chemical composition. But establishing what item of clothing we're looking at can be more of a challenge. And so fortunately, this dissolved organic matter has these certain fluorescent properties which allow us to study and understand its underlying complexity. And so light at certain wavelengths is passed through this liquid sample to provide scans, which we also call excitation emission matrices. It's this thing in the bottom right-hand corner. And these scans are then analyzed to identify specific components present in the sample. And those components are then uploaded to an open source database, which allows us to compare findings across studies. And this is all quite new. We've only really started using this technology maybe in the last 5 to 10 years, and it's never been done here in Essex, and it's never been done looking at soil and water in tandem. But so using fluorescent properties of organic matter, we can sort out these unraveling knit items into piles according to type. So we can know what type of carbon we're looking at, essentially. And if we're going to further the knit metaphor, imagine that the carbon itself is the yarn, and all the knots and beads and baubles are nitrogen and phosphorus and other minerals. Historically, when we've been tackling eutrophication of the Great Lakes, we focused our attention on these baubles, on the nitrogen and the phosphorus, more than the sweater itself, which is holding the nutrients. That's the carbon. Like the carbon is literally carrying these nutrients into the lake. And carbon plays a major role in binding and modulating nutrients. And so we believe it may be, in fact, the overlooked key to managing these systems. If we have richer, more complex carbon stocks, they're associated with richer, more resilient soil ecosystems, and therefore studying this carbon complexity may offer us a better understanding of how these systems function. And so my research aims to bring together the work being done in both the soil and the water environments, and we're using Essex as a case study. So essentially, I'm studying both the soil and the water to see if we can see the impact of these agricultural conservation measures on soil carbon, which is a measure of soil health. So for my study, I've curated a gradient of established management practices that are currently being done on private farms here in Essex. I've got a modern conventional agriculture system with regular tillage. That's regular agriculture with plowed fields. I have a no-till category, which is a regular agriculture without tillage or with reduced tillage. And I also have a conservation agriculture category, which has some conservation tillage, which is like a little bit of tillage, plus some cover crops and some microbial amendments. And then we also included 2 restored Carolinian forest sites. So one was Maidstone Conservation Area, and the other was a privately held woodlot. Both forest sites, like much of the wooded areas here in the county, have been restored following agricultural land uses. So for Maidstone, in particular, I know that restoration efforts began there in the 1950s, and the site was actually only officially protected from the 1970s. And so I see that site as at least 50, possibly more years post-restoration. And what we know is that previous studies have shown that there are discrete differences in the type of organic matter among the broad categories, such as urban, forest, or agriculture. But when they've looked to see if they can pick out the impact of agricultural action, of management actions on agricultural soils, the results have been mixed. So we carried out an extensive soil sampling campaign in the fall. Emily Brown, who I think spoke here last year, was one of my main helpers. I think she's even in the audience tonight. So there we are. We dug soil pits down to 60 centimeters. We basically Swiss cheesed a bunch of fields and some forest areas. And then earlier this year, we sampled the tile drains associated with these soil sampling sites. We collected tile runoff during the snow melt events and following the first of the spring rains, which is when we know most nutrients flush from the fields. And although I'm not finished writing up my data, I can give you an idea of what we're seeing. So this here, what you're seeing in front of you, is a series of EAMs, those scans, and they represent a single borehole from surface down to 60 centimeters in a conservation agriculture system. You can see the change with depth as this organic matter decreases from the surface as you move down. You can also see a change in the fluorescent brightness as well as the general pattern of fluorescence. But to really understand these scans, you have to put them into a model, which separates the scans into the carbon types or components associated with these specific fluorescent peaks. So if you remember the sweater, and if you remember my sweater analogy, this is the sorting the knit items into piles part. And then so when I analyzed my scans, I found a 3-component model. We've got 2 humic components, and the third is a microbial derived protein, which is associated with processing of terrestrial carbon. And so from my data, we're thinking that this third component, that's the one that's associated with carbon stored deeper and long-term in soils. And so here's a little bit of my data. So looking first at the soils, we found no significant difference between our site categories, even when comparing the agricultural soil and the restored forest soils. And this is really surprising because we know forested areas are generally a lot more complex than agricultural areas. So when I'm able to add my total soil organic matter data into the coming weeks, it might give me some additional data. But right now, at least it seems in this region that even after more than 50 years, our restored forests still look and potentially even function remarkably like agricultural soils. And this is in direct contrast to findings in other areas, which have compared forest and agricultural lands. So I'll add too that this data still needs to be peer reviewed, but my main takeaway here is that I see that the true restoration of agricultural lands, at least on Brookston Clay, of which most of Essex County is, either via conservation measures or agricultural restoration of natural cover, this may take considerably longer than we'd ever expected. And this has really big implications for how we view both restoration and conservation of these agricultural lands. So it may look like a forest, but it's not functioning like a forest. And that's the sort of main takeaway. And it's super interesting. And another finding from my work was that the dissolved organic matter in soils, it differs a lot from the dissolved organic matter leaving the tile drains. And so more specifically, we're finding that some components are leaching faster than others and other ones are sticking in the soil. And so humic component 2 was significantly higher in the tile water, whereas my microbially derived tryptophan type was significantly lower. So this might indicate that there's that different components are being transported at different rates, and that potentially maybe this microbially derived component is potentially less easily leached and transported, which could be why it's so good for long-term storage. It also could just be a result of those cracks or those predetermined flow paths I mentioned. If you picture how easily clay cracks, if you pour water onto a crack of clay, it's just going to shoot straight through the crack and maybe enter the tile drain. And so maybe we're not, it's not leaching through the whole soil column. But these are important implications for freshwater nutrient management because we've always just assumed that what's coming out of the tile drain directly reflects exactly what's happening in the soil. And I think we're starting to see that there is a little bit of a difference. And this might be why we've had so much trouble preventing phosphorus runoff from fields. And so a big part of our lab's ethos is the co-creation of solutions. Those who live and work on the land always know the land best. And this is why we've partnered with farmers and landowners. Like all of our research is done in actual landscapes as opposed to in the lab. And so I'm going to put it out to you now that there are solutions. Oh, hang on. Sorry. Yeah. And so I'm going to put it out to you now. If there are any solutions that you think we're missing or could be implemented or maybe are being implemented somewhere else, or you know that are being implemented in the county we don't know about, like I'd love to hear about them or hear your thoughts on what I presented today. If you think that, yeah, if you think that there's anything more we could be doing or looking at, like we're really interested in hearing ideas from the community. And you can feel free to type that in the chat, or maybe you can sit on this and think about it, and I'll just go through my last 2 slides and then we can sit and have the chat afterwards. Otherwise, I'm going to share my email in 2 slides time. You're welcome to also drop me an email if you have any thoughts after this, but I'd really, really like to have that chat. So. And then finally, we are constantly looking for farm owners and landowners to partner with particularly people with wetlands or ponds on their land, people who are farming, and it can be any kind of farming. We have spaces, we have an interest in looking at all kinds of practices. And then we also are working very heavily in the drains and rivers. We have a Phragmites research group going. We have a student looking at carbon in agricultural drains. We have mussel surveys going. So if there's any, if you're interested in talking to us or partnering with us, we're also looking at maybe bringing a conservation program into Windsor Essex, where we would be able to sort of take over the marginal lands on farms and restore them back to conservation. So if you know of anyone who might be interested, or if you might be interested, you can join our mailing list. Excuse the typo there next to email. It's the Healthy Headwaters at uwindsor.ca, and it'll be again on the next slide, so don't panic too much. So yeah, if you want to know more, thank you for listening today. If you'd like to follow our progress or get in touch or chat about conservation and soil health, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts.
Do you know if any of these perennial crops are have been planted in this region or in southwestern Ontario?
I haven't seen them in Canada. I think they might be trialing, I mean, in Ontario, I think they might be trialing some on the prairies. Last I heard, there was something going on at the University of Alberta, but from a commercial perspective, I think they're growing them currently in the US. And I'm not sure what the impact of our winters might not be on a perennial. I think we would probably, I don't know if that particular species that they've put together is winter hardy enough, or if it would need to be further bred to develop that winter hardiness.
We're pretty mild winters compared to much of the West Prairie region of the U.S. So I've been to many North American prairie conferences, and there's been many presentations on the idea of using perennial crops.
Yeah, this is why it's so exciting that they finally got it out for commercial sale and use. Like I'm really excited about the fact that they're starting to filter into our market. And if you go to some of the fancier food stores in the US, you can buy sort of fancy perennial wheat puffs and breads. And so I think it's an exciting time in perennial agriculture for sure.
Yes, I see. There are some comments.
Let me open up the chat now that I can look. Yeah. Proposed solution: convert about 50% of our farmland back to prairie and wetland. Yeah, definitely looking at reducing meat consumption. And I think another thing that we don't often consider here in Windsor Essex is a lot of our row crops don't actually go towards food. They go towards biofuels. And so if you're standing at the pump at the petrol station or whatever, and you're filling up your car and it says it may contain 10% bioethanol, that is often where a lot of our row crops are going. And when I say row crops, I'm talking about corn and soy. A lot of the row crops in Windsor Essex also go to the, they go to JP Wiser's. And so they will help with ethanol production. And so I think I definitely agree that we could grow less row crops and we could grow more food instead of growing row crops to feed animals or biodiesel or etc. Like a much better solution if we are going to be eating meat would be to grow the animals where the meat, like to basically grow the fodder and range our animals on grassland. So we have rotational grazing, and it gets a little bit trickier the further north we go, but at least here in Southern Ontario, I know of farmers here in Essex County who are doing just that. They rotate their animals through their fields and then they feed them lucerne from the same fields during the winter, and they manage to have a closed loop system. So that kind of agriculture is very efficient, but we do have to cut back on how much meat we would eat to keep that fully sustainable. Yeah.
I've seen operations like that just south of Comber, where they still are maintaining large pastures and rotating cattle on them, but it's very rare still in Essex County.
It's so rare in Essex County, and I think it's got to do with the cost of land ownership here. And so if the actual cost per acre is a lot higher in Windsor Essex than it is elsewhere in Ontario. And that's why a lot of the farmers say that things that are trialed elsewhere may not necessarily work here, in addition to the clay. Or I also see there's another comment here talking about how farmers are constantly evaluating how much are farmers constantly evaluating how much fertilizer is needing in their fields, depending on soil type, crop type, or is it chemical company recommendations? It's a bit of both. So agriculture's come a long way. There's something called precision agriculture now, where you can set your machinery or your sprayers to a GPS, and so you can and that can link up to your soil test results, so you can know which part of your fields are maybe low in phosphorus and apply more phosphorus in that part of the field than you would in another part of the field. And so that's really part of that 4R technique, where you're really considering it. The 4Rs are like asking you, like, when are you treating, how much are you treating, and do you have to put that much, is it needed? And so that kind of precision agriculture is really, it's really helpful, and it's really brought down the nutrient runoff, but it's not the whole solution, because it's still just, if you have a big rain, or if there is any kind of precipitation that pushes those nutrients down through those tile drains, they're still flying out into the lake. And so the real question is, how do we keep the nutrients in the fields where we need them and not shoot them into the lake? And so yes, they're not just spraying them everywhere, because let's be honest, fertilizer is expensive. If farmers could spray less, they would spray less, but often it's a bit of trying to figure out how much is enough, because soil tests are also expensive. Yeah. There are a couple of organic farms. I know specifically there's one guy farming in the counter. Sorry, I'm just looking at the questions if anybody was wondering where I'm getting this from. There's somebody in Harrow. He's got a wonderful organic farming operation, and he actually does corn and soy organically. We also have some farmers further north in the county who are doing at least food grade corn and soy. So corn and soy that goes into meals, as opposed to in ethanol or into the cash crop market. So there is a fair bit of organic farming, not as much as I'd like to see. I think people think that because our Brixton clay is so heavy, it's hard to do some of the things that you would do in other organic systems, maybe, where you would need to till, like, because the farmers here use tillage to deal with organic farmers use tillage to deal with weeds instead of herbicides, and so it gets quite difficult on our clays. But there are a few guys doing it here. Yeah, there's one very good guy down in Harrow who's trying some really interesting things, and we've been working with him. So yeah. We're farming garlic and other veggies on a small scale in Peely Island with a restoration project, using zero applied nutrients, relying on long fallows to restore fertility. Yeah, that's definitely something that is awesome, especially when you're growing lots of root vegetables. They're pulling nutrients up from further down in the soil crop, and long fallow periods work, and they're great as long as we're keeping the soils covered in the winter. Sometimes the fallow periods can result in carbon being emitted from the soils when they're lying bare, and it can also leave them exposed to soil fertility. Yes, Leslie LeBear is the established organic farmer in Cottam. It's her farm I was talking about with the closed loop rotational grazing system. I actually buy all my meat there. Shout out to Leslie LeBear, happiest meat in Essex County. The clay soil not being a valid excuse. We have very vigorous debates we have a farming research group where we have a bunch of farmers from all spectrums. We've got indigenous farmers, we've got conventional farmers, we've got conservation farmers, and we all sit on this farming advisory board once a year, and there have been some very spirited debates about whether or not the clay soil is an excuse. Some farmers say no, and other farmers are holding up photos proving that these techniques do work here because they're literally doing them on their lands, while other farmers are saying that potentially it's not possible. So it's really interesting. There's a vigorous debate about farmers about how different Brixton clay is and whether or not it prevents us from being maybe more innovative in this region. But I think the only answer to that is research, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring data on Brixton clay, and yeah, so I don't know if there's any other comments. I'm just answering them as they pop up.
Well, if there are no further comments at this time, should note that this session is recorded and will go up on our YouTube channel, the Field Naturalist Club's YouTube channel. So many members will get a chance to see it later on at their own convenience. So we get many people looking at our channel afterwards. So you may get questions down the road.
No worries. I'm happy. We've got all of our contacts. As I said, feel free to get in touch. We have a mailing list. We're planning on when things open up and it's not so virtual, having some soil health days where we're going to walk farms and you can talk to farmers, meet farmers. We're also planning on like a community science project where we're going to ask people to bring us like a scoop of their soil, wherever they may be, garden soil or farm soil, and we're going to run a kind of Windsor Essex soil project on it. So we've got some plans. So it might be a fun thing to join our mailing list. We've been a bit slow getting out mailings during the COVID period, but the plan is to kind of ramp that up as we get more and more data. We're still a new research group, which also has kind of, helped us to, it's been hard to start everything up in a virtual environment, but we're getting there. Yeah. So thank you for listening and thanks for chatting soil health with me.
Well, thank you very, very much. It was an excellent presentation, a lot to think about, and it's another way of tackling problems in the natural environment from a different perspective than we normally do. Best of luck.
Thank you. Yeah, and as I said, we're working across multiple spaces. We're also working in the drain spaces. In Windsor Essex County, we don't have rivers, we have drains. And so we're also looking at how we can improve those spaces to make them function more like rivers. So there's a lot of work being done within our lab that's very interesting. I think Ryan Graham, our Phragmites guy, is coming to talk to you next month. He's also in the same lab. He's going to come in to talk to you about his work into looking at Phragmites in the drains. So yeah, just watch this healthy headwaters space. We've got a lot on the go. Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Good evening.